worse in lower MMRs than he is in higher, right? Um, Higher MMRs, it's like, yep, Lee Sin is really strong there, very clearly. He has not yet, in previous patches, gotten to the point where we have felt it mandatory to nerf him due to his pick and ban in very high MMRs, or his win rate in high MMRs for that matter. In fact, he probably wins a lot less games in very high MMR than you might expect. That being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that we won't nerf him or that we shouldn't nerf him. He it may have recently crossed the ban threshold. It's possible that that's true. Um, and the truth here is that like all the metrics kind of say that, well, all the metrics except for the part where he recently crossed the ban threshold for being nerfed. All the metrics basically say Lee Sin is powerful in high MMR, but not very good in lower MMRs, and so that's kind of what led us to be afraid of nerfing him, and also even to give him the health regen that we thought would be good for low MMRs. Which, by the way, it did work. It like very slightly closed the gap, not significantly, but um, very slightly. Very slightly closed the gap, which was good for us, right? It's like, so it ended up overall being great. So the short of it is that like my personal thought here is like I think that Lee Sin, I kind of wish that the original designers of Wild Rift, and this is not to flame them, they had a very difficult job, and I like understand that they had a very tough time making these decisions. But it's like I kind of do wish that the original designers who worked on Champions in Wild Rift had considered like what the implications of making Lee Sin's safeguard like free target actually would be in the long term, because I think truthfully, like making it not connected to the ward was probably the right call, but I think that Lee Sin probably needed another meaningful weakness to be added to the kit. Is my expectation, is like my suspicion, and I think that over time we'll probably see Lee Sin's lower MMR win rate go up to match. Like PC actually had that same thing happen where if you look at like PC data from like season 3 or season 4, the gap for MMR between Lee Sin and low and high MMR is actually much larger than it is today. And some of that is probably the changes that PC's made, but some of it's also just players getting better at him. But I think it probably should have been like the original designers maybe should have been a little bit more cognizant of like what would happen with Lee Sin if they just made his safeguard free target, which is kind of why we're seeing some problems with the champion now. Is my suspicion. I'm not 100% sure. And again, that's not to like flame them. They had a lot of very tough decisions to make and not a lot of time to make them. And so it's like I understand they had to make decisions, and they probably said like, look, we don't have time to consider the implications of what this means. We just think this is the best version of the champion, and let's just ship it. But that's kind of my perspective on it. Is like, I think we're dealing with a problem that's kind of been given to us by the original design. Not that it's like something that they intentionally were like, haha, we tricked the balance designers, like anything like that. It's just more along the lines of like, they had a tough call to make. They made a tough call, and now we're dealing with the results of that tough call. So that's kind of my thoughts on Lee Sin. Is like I think he's going to be really difficult to balance, and that's kind of a long term problem. Why isn't pick ban rate and lower elos a factor in whether a champion is buffed or nerfed? It is. So I don't think pick rate actually enters into our framework, but ban rate actually is in lower MMRs. So if people think that something is really frustrating and they ban it a lot, or they think it's really OP, that actually does factor into our framework. Like I said in the original tweet where I linked that framework, um, there have been updates to the framework since then. That article is quite old. It's from like March last year or something. It's like almost a year old. So there have been some updates to the framework, but we don't have a more recent article, so that was the best thing I could give you. Let's see. Why does stream only have 1080 quality? I think you're not the only person that asked me that, but I don't know. So will mythic items ever come to Wild Rift? Unlikely, not guaranteed, no, but I think it's very unlikely. Certain items from the mythic system might come in at some point, like in slightly different form, but the actual mythic item system is very unlikely. I also have a question about that further up. Are any champions getting nerfed for being anti-fun rather than strictly strong? Yes, we have done that before. Champions that are very frustrating, that are within acceptable bands of power, we do nerf. If we believe players find them frustrating enough, we will nerf them just for being frustrating. But we will generally try to target things that we think are frustrating but not necessarily powerful. Examples of champions that have been nerfed for this reason in the past are Akali, is probably the best example. So that's it. So this is a really long Twitter DM. I split it up into 3 sections. It would be nice to get a new updated balancing article. I agree. It would be nice to do that. We'll probably at least have a conversation about maybe doing it. I don't know if we should though, but like that's more of a question for comms people, but possible. Is it possible to replace Phase Rush with another impactful room, even with UI limitation slots? Yes, I would personally like to replace several runes in the current system. There is also, by the way, like I think this wasn't clear when I was talking about it. There is one more slot in the current UI system we can use if we do a small amount of reconfiguring and resizing of the icons. It's not free to add one more, but it is lower cost than adding like two more. So it's possible to add one more with a small effort. Um, anyway, let's get to this next question. I've gotten too distracted by chat. Sorry. But let me get to this next question here. Does Balance Team have any rules like where if a champion has one property, they can't have another? There aren't strict rules around like, hey, if a champion has a ground targeted dash, they are not also allowed to have this thing or whatever, right? It's like, um, we do not have strict rules about this. But uh, there are some general rules of like this combination of things is really dangerous, right? It's like an example of what that looks like is in general tools that cover the weaknesses of other tools that the champion has. An example of that would be a Kali, like. Hey, one of her weaknesses is that she's supposed to be, the original design intent, and this is obviously not true, right? Like this is clearly is not panned out to be the case. The original design intent for a Kali was that she was supposed to be a weak team fighter, right? But her shroud is actually one of the most powerful zoning tools in the entire game, right? Like, um, there's obviously a lot of power in shroud, in like how powerful it is as a zoning tool, which is a powerful team fighting tool. So it's kind of like, hey, her intended weakness doesn't really pan out if the player is really good and they understand how to use her shroud really well and how to use her ultimate and obviously the rest of her mobility really well. And so that's the kind of thing where um, that's the kind of thing where it's like again, it's not to say that we can never do it because there are some champions where the tools can cover their weaknesses and that's okay given that they have the right number of weaknesses and the right sharpness of their weaknesses. But there aren't really any specific rules where it's like you can't have X if you have Y. Aside from like you can't have a strong late game if you also have a strong early and mid game. Like in terms of power curve, it's like yes, there are some general rules in this sense of like you can't do everything really well. Like that's just not allowed. But in the general sense of like you can't have X mechanic if you have Y mechanic, no, not really. We don't have rules about that. So that's sort of my the framing here of like, yeah, you like we don't have hard rules around what you can and cannot have if you have some other thing. But there are general rules, and there are like, yes, if you're really strong in one area of the power, like in one specific area of like game time, you need to have an appropriate weakness at another game time to make up for that strength, right? Like you can't just have a champion that is like a good early laner, a good mid game champion that's also a hyper carry, right? Like that doesn't make sense. So that's why you see champions like Kale that have really strong late game. Our intention is that they have a weak early game, right? And we might not always hit that goal immediately, especially when we release champions, but that's our goal long term. Let me check chat here real quick. Can we expect more collab between professional play / top tier team / players and the balance team to offer more insight rather than relying solely on metrics with the currently problematic matchmaking in place? Um, there's probably more. You should probably expect more of it, but I don't expect like don't take this as like, oh, we're suddenly going to start spending 20 hours a week talking to people or anything like that. I'm certainly trying to reach out and talk to more people about like to get their perspectives. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm always going to just like do whatever people say or anything like that, right? It's like you know. There's a classic game design statement. I think Mark Rosewater originally is the one who said that. Is like players are really good at identifying problems, but very bad at suggesting solutions. Just like I think that's generally true. Um, I think it's great to get to talk to people to sort of identify problems. The suggesting solution space, maybe not so much. But there are some really like definitely some real value in talking to like really strong players. Like particularly good players and pro players. Like coordinated play is also a completely different beast, and that's something that's really good where talking to people can provide a lot of value, especially about coordinated play. Um, Another really big thing here about this, by the way, is like something I talked about earlier for people who weren't here or didn't catch this. We recently put out offers for the game analysis team for Wild Rift, so we can get some like very high MMR players and very skilled, like very invested players to come in and do game analysis for us. So hopefully that'll come in soon. I'm not sure exactly when they'll be starting, but that's something that we're working on. Um, Okay, so I'm gonna skip rest of chat for now and get back to the question. So, Also, any thoughts on balancing for champions with strong DPS slash auto attacks? I feel like champions with strong auto attacks like Yasuo have an unaccounted advantage in being able to farm jungle, which means they can enter mid game or mid slash late game with a gold lead or come back from a gold deficit, say versus say a brand who cannot clear jungle between camps as easily. One second here. Sorry, I'm getting thirsty here, just talking all this through all this stuff. Okay, so um, I would say that there is an advantage, like there is a meaningful advantage for DP, like champions that do a lot of DPS being able to clear camps. I don't think it's unaccounted for. It is something that is slightly high MMR skewed for sure, right? Like I assure you that being able to clear camps efficiently as a non-jungle champion is high MMR skewed. So like that's something that definitely causes skew. Uh, but I could also say that we already recognize skew, and we have not only metrics set up to track this, but it's also something that we're particularly paying attention to when we do balance. I also think brand is an interesting example here of like uh, what a like of a champion that doesn't farm jungle well, because like when I think about brand, I think about like the 1 in 8 brands that I've seen that like kill like that will like one shot people, right? It's like yes, it might be true that Brand isn't as good at recovering or farming up a lead. But I would also say that most champions that are not good at farming jungle camps are also better, like good with less amount, like lower amounts of gold, right? It's like typically speaking, it's not a 1-to-1 correlation, but I'd say there's a pretty strong correlation between being able to efficiently farm jungle camps as a laner and needing a lot of gold to function, right? Like a champion like Yasuo needs a lot of gold to function. That's like this is like kind of a self-balancing, lever, right? It's like, um, yeah. That's like one of the things I would take the perspective on. Is again, this isn't a 1-to-1, correlation here, but generally speaking, it is something that is correlated, and in the outlier cases where it's not correlated, we can just address those balance concerns individually. I would say that we do account for these like this advantage, right? It's like it's just a high MMR skewed thing where low elo players aren't going to farm jungle as efficiently. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Um, and so this is sort of something along the lines of like, yeah, we do pay attention to this and we do account for it to some degree. Maybe not as much as we should, but uh, that's just how it is. Uh, all right, let me check some questions in the chat here real quick. It's a lot to take in. Yeah, it's a lot to talk about, Stu. I'm probably gonna need to get more water before I'm even through a couple of tabs here, so we'll see how that works out. Good evening, Skyrinks. For me, it's morning actually. Well, it's about to be noon here, since I'm on the West Coast in America. But yeah, good evening for you, um, wherever you happen to be. Will there be event game modes like Ascension and Odyssey? I'm not sure. I That is another team there is actually a team that works on in-game called the modes team. It's not the team that I work on, so I actually don't know what they're working on. Like literally, this is an example. Like I couldn't tell you if I did know. Like I could tell you if I did know. I could tell you if I knew or not. I couldn't tell you what it is. Like if they're working on something, big upcoming or whatever. But like I can literally just tell you straight up, I don't know what they're working on. I have no idea. Actually, no idea. Is Lethal Tempo coming to Wild Rift? Cannot tell you whether Lethal Tempo is coming to Wild Rift or not. I can tell you that I personally am not a huge fan of the new Lethal Tempo from PC. So, uh, like for what it's worth, I don't love it. So I would not personally be a fan of adding it to Wild Rift unless we felt like it was truly necessary. Um, and like there's some things that I don't love about the game. It's like there's some things that that I've proposed for the game that have even made it into the game where I'm like, I think this is the right thing to do, but I don't love this this specific item change or whatever. Like this balance change is like sometimes you got to do what you got to do to like achieve the goals, right? Even if you don't love what you're doing. Um, anyway, so let's move on to the next question here. Are there broader views of champion class balancing? For example, if you notice Aurelia slash Jarvan slash Zinzao are doing really well, does that mean at that point you start to look at why the entire class is doing well and start inspecting bruiser itemization in classes that counter bruisers or classes that are countered by bruisers? We do this to some degree. For example, this is actually one of the things that we do with items. And there's another question about that later on that I'll talk about this more, I believe, in the items section. But this is how we ended up buffing Essence Reaver, actually, was we were looking at all the champions that we think should buy Essence Reaver, and we're like, these champions are all kind of bad, and they're actually not buying Essence Reaver. So very clearly, like, if no one's buying Essence Reaver, all the Essence Reaver champions appear to be weak. we should just buff Essence Reaver. That's like why we ended up buffing Essence Reaver, and maybe we should have buffed it more, to be clear. It's like, it doesn't seem like we actually hit the goal here of like making it competitive with the other options in all cases. But um, yes, we do this. We do often end up looking at like, hey, if all these champions in a class or some subset of a class are doing really well or really poorly, that is usually what causes us to look at things like runes, items, other systemic factors like counters, etc. So we do 100% take these broader views. We actually have several meetings a week where we meet up and we're like, hey, let's identify the problem spaces that we want to tackle like right now. And that's sort of where we can like look at these things in a list. Like we could say like, oh, champion A, B, and C. Oh, these champions are all part of like X subclass, like caster 80 carries or whatever. And it's like, hey, is there a common factor here between these champions that we should be looking at instead? And that's kind of where we end up getting to like the point where, hey, that's where we start looking at items. That's where we start looking at the systemic factors. So that's kind of a simpler answer. Oh, hey, what's going on, Hells? Let me, here you go. You can have a VIP. Until I run out of them, I'll just keep giving them to people. Oh, unable to add VIP. Okay, sorry. You can't have it. Oh, it's because I spelled it wrong. That makes sense. There you go. Now you can be a VIP. Uh, um, Nasher's Tooth buff, please. That'd be cool. I'd have to take a look at Nasher's Tooth. I actually have no idea what the data on that item is. Um, instead of adding new things, can you guys replace them with better versions like Riftmaker over Rod of Ages? There's some consideration of like, at some point we're gonna get to the point where we're like, we have enough, we have enough items, we have enough runes. We're actually pretty close to that point on runes, partially because of the UI, partially because we're like, we don't want to add a million new runes. But yeah, there's gonna be some consideration for replacing stuff for sure. Does Fimbulwinter fulfill its purpose in your eyes? I think it does fulfill its purpose, but I think it could be better. I think the version that PC designed is actually better than the original Wild Rift version. So there's some potential that we might want to like just make some small changes to get the PC version for that. So the explanation you gave about Jin makes a lot of sense. Him being strong mid game, useless late game makes him seem really bad. Yeah, I agree. Again, that's something that we want to address, but it's again something I've been talking about a little bit on the stream previously. Like in this stream, is like I can't tell people what we are or are not working on, so I can't just be like we are working on Jin or we aren't working on Jin. It's like I can't tell you, so sorry, but like I can only tell you like what our thoughts are. That's just kind of the deal. It's like I have an NDA and I can't tell you what the upcoming stuff is. But yeah, power curves is something that we're definitely going to be really cognizant of in the future when we're doing champions. Will pink rewards ever come to Wild Rift soon? I don't know. That's something that we've talked about internally. It's not something that we've worked on. It would require changing the UI for like the trinket slot or doing something else. So that's not like a an unstoppable barrier, but it is like a hurdle to get over in terms of like we would like to do something to give counterplay to champions like Eve, but there's also some consideration that like, hey, maybe Eve should just have that counterplay on her kit instead of making a systemic thing for that, because really right now the only significant point of counterplay for that is Eve, right? Because Rengar already has that built into his ultimate. So that's kind of where it's at. Where it's at. Twisted Treeline. I don't think Twisted Treeline is likely. Again, I'm not on the modes team, so I have no idea what they're working on. But I think that Twisted Treeline is pretty unlikely. It was never a very popular game mode in PC. Even when it did get some like pretty significant systemic changes to try and improve the game mode, that never drove very much interest. So I think it's unlikely that we would do something exactly like Twisted Treeline. I think something like Twisted Treeline that is a little bit better or like better in some respects, that's like more likely to attract more players that like people would actually enjoy long term. I think that's more likely in the long term, but again, I don't know what they're working on and I'm not on that team, so I couldn't really tell you. Do you like Echo? Yes, I've played lots of Echo. I think he's like in PC, I think he's like my 5th highest mastery champion. Actually, I do quite like Echo. I'm a big fan. One question, not sure if you've ever answered this. What's your opinion on pink wards being added? I think they would do some good things for the game, but I am also not convinced that we shouldn't just add systemic counterplay to Evelynn and to other camo champions because there's so few of them, and it's kind of like we could add a systemic form of counterplay to like camo champions and to like obviously pink wards do other things besides systemically counter camo champions. Like there's obviously some other stuff that they do, like they give you something to play around, it like give you brush control, like they can allow you to sweep, they have a, like sort of a combo sweeper, trinket like type of thing. There's a lot of things that they do, right? Obviously there's some cool things about them. I am not 100% convinced that we should make pink wards over just like doing systemic counterplay for Eve and other camo champions. I'm also not convinced that like pink wards wouldn't just be a good ad by themselves. Like I'm just like I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the topic, to be perfectly honest with you. So I couldn't really say like, hey, what does a good version of the pink ward system look like in Wild Rift? I'm not sure, right? Because it's like it probably needs to go on the trinket, which means we need to have a third trinket slot. What does that look like? Like, what is, how does that actually work? I'm not sure, right? It's like, so, again, that's something I'm not entirely clear on. So I don't have like a strong answer of like, this is what exactly what I think. Like, I'll probably spend some more time thinking about it in the near future, honestly. Okay. I've spent a lot of time answering chat questions. I'm going to go back to the doc. I haven't even gotten through the first tab yet, so that's not ideal. Um, Okay. Will you be changing Ari to match League's upcoming update to her kit? We don't know yet. It's going to depend on how successful the update is in PC. Basically, we like doing these small scale reworks, but in the case of something like the Ari changes and like the Amumu changes that PC did, for example, where we did add them up, it's like we're gonna like watch and we can see if they're successful in PC, and if they're not successful in PC, then we're probably not going to do them, right? It's like if they're not, we're not going to put the effort in of making these changes for Ari if people don't like them in PC, because they probably won't like them in Wild Rift either. So basically what we're doing here is we're just letting PC take the risk for us in this case. Just like in reverse, like for example, this has actually already happened in reverse. An example of what this looks like is Diana. Diana in Wild Rift was being designed to have the swap between her dash and her moonfall. Um, in Wild Rift. This came to PC like, you might think if you think back to the timeline, you might think, "Oh, but that happened in PC before Wild Rift came out." When Diana was being made in Wild Rift, that was like kind of shown internally to be like really successful. People really liked it. And so that's why PC did that change. And so they sort of like saw what this looked like and saw like, hey, this actually is just really good. And PC designers had thought for a long time that this should be done. So it's kind of like a slam dunk in terms of like, hey, everyone knows we should do this. But in the terms of the Ari thing, it's like it's a little riskier, and we're not 100% sure that it's going to be great. And so if we're not confident that it's going to be really like really good for us, then we're not going to do it. And the same thing is true for Janna, by the way. I see a topic question about that. It's like, hey, if people really like the Janna rework in PC when it's balanced, because right now I don't really trust the numbers on like how popular it is because she's just very overpowered. Is my perception. I'm not 100% sure that's true, but I'm pretty sure there's like a bug where Glacial lasts longer or something, and she's just insanely powerful. I think that bug's already fixed, but basically, if the reworks are successful in the short and medium term, we'll probably do them, or at least we'll have a good conversation about doing them, for sure. Okay, whew. 1 second here. Okay. Let's see. Okay. All right. So let me take a couple questions from chat here real quick. I really like Janna changes on PC. I like them too, like some parts of them for sure. And Janna's really unpopular in Wild Rift, by the way. She's like, I believe she's the lowest depth champion, meaning that if you play her in Wild Rift, you're least likely to play another game, which kind of speaks to like we probably have some work to do. We'll see if it ends up being exactly the PC rework, but we'll see. Yeah, I believe off the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that she's actually the lowest depth champion in Wild Rift. Um, Let's see. Okay, so how do you decide to give a huge buff slash nerf to a champion? For example, Kale got absolutely destroyed this patch. Did she really have a 60+% win rate or something? Um, I believe her win rate was over 56, like slightly over 56, and our previous nerf was not very effective. Basically, our concern was like we don't want to keep having this champion show up in the patch notes. Um, and so our perspective was like, look, let's just take a big swing that we're pretty confident will get the job done. And if we need to buff her later, we will happily buff her later, right? Like we would love to be able to buff a champion like Kale. Like that would be great if we could. Um, so the truth here is that like how do I put this? Uh Basically, especially with a new champion, especially with one that's as like as like sharp in terms of like game curve as Kale, we want to be careful with their balance where we like don't leave them really OP for a really long time, where it's kind of some expectation that you just pick Kale and you win because you didn't lose the early game mega hard, right? It's like um the reality here is like we nerfed her once in a way that we thought was going to be pretty impactful, and then it didn't actually do that much. And so we just said, hey, second time, let's just do something really significant and make sure that we get her into a spot where we're going to be able to either like like we were pretty confident we were either going to get her balanced, which would be great if it happened, or we could buff her. And we would love to buff that champion, right? It's like, we love buffing champions. Like, I mean, in general, we love buffing champions. That's like one of our favorite things to do on my team. It's like buffing champions is awesome, right? Like just straight up, it's like probably one of the most fun things to do is like figure out what kind of like new sweet thing you can do for a champion or like what you can buff. Um, but just generally, it's like we prefer not to over nerf champions if we can avoid it. But it's like this is a situation where we were like, look, we just need to go for this. Like we just need to go for a big swing here, because our last nerf didn't do as much as we expected, and we do not want to like chain nerf this champion 3 to 4 times in a row to like get her into a good spot. Sometimes that's the appropriate thing to do, but I think with a new champion with a really sharp power curve like Kale, that it's way better to just go for something heavy. All right. Let's see. Okay, makes sense because the nerf is huge. So you just look at how the nerf champion does and then decide how to react to it. Yeah, some of it is like, um, you know, some of it is how much time we're willing to invest in a champion and like how much effort we think would be to buff them later. It's like if we think it would be really complicated and hard to buff them later, then that's a situation where we might not go for the heavy swing and we might do the nerf slowly over the course of several patches. Some of it also has to do with the timing between patches, right? It's like we didn't want to just leave Kale OP for a long period of time. That's one of the reasons why we went for the big swing. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just there's a lot of factors. I can't talk through the like minute details of every single factor, but uh, that's sort of like the general sense of it is that we went for that. Thank you for taking the time to give more information about your choices of the players. Yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming by. Any Zaya news? Not right now, no. What made the decision of adding Emerald rank? That is a matchmaking / ranked system question that I cannot answer. That would be a question you'd have to ask in a round game designer, and I am an in-game designer. Those are two very separate teams at Wild Rift. So to sort of describe the structure of teams, I am on the systems and balance team, which is like down here. That's like the lowest level of team that I'm on. It's a very small team. Then that's part of the core game modes team, which encompasses a few different teams. Then that is part of in-game, which is like my team, the modes team, the champs team, for example. There's a few like the people who do controls, etc. Right? Then the larger Wild Rift umbrella has another team that's kind of similar but separate that's called Around Game, which contains I don't know exactly how their structuring is, but it's like that team has like matchmaking, the rank system, all those other separate teams. So we're like separated at a pretty high level, if that makes sense. How do I do this? It's like, we're separated at like pretty high up in the Wild Rift hierarchy. So I don't really, spend much of any time talking to them or knowing what their thoughts are, like to be perfectly honest with you. So, um, lowest level team, not in the sense of like that we're bad or anything, but in the sense of like the lowest denomination of separation, if that makes sense. Um, so hopefully that helps. All right, so let's get to the next question. Jhin and Asol buff. So I've talked about this previously on stream. I've talked about both of these. So the Jhin one, the short answer, if you want the longer answer, I'm not going to go into the longer form answer. The short answer is we think that the ultimate problem with Jhin is because of his power curve. We don't think that the fundamental problem is that he's not strong enough. Like by the data, he actually performs overall fine. It's that his power curve is kind of off in Wild Rift comparatively to where it is in PC and where players probably should expect it to be. So Jhin specifically is probably going to be a power shift when we get to it. I think it is likely that we will do that at some point. I cannot guarantee that we'll do it, but it is something we definitely want to do. For Asol, I also talked about this one previously. This is another thing that you should go back and look at my stream previously if you're really interested in this. But the short of it, here's like the highlights of it is like, number one, people think Asol is a one-trick champion. He is not. Number two, Asol is already very powerful. Number three, Asol isn't that fun to play for the overwhelming majority of players, even when he's extremely powerful. In fact, even when he's been at his most powerful, and by the way, for many patches in this game, he's been the most powerful champion just objectively by win rate. Not the current patch, but in many patches in the past, he still was never popular, even when he was literally the best champion to play in the game in terms of just straight up winning games. So it's kind of like I don't know. It's just Asol is unlikely to get buffed. We know that him being powerful doesn't make him popular. People don't want to play him, and he's already powerful. It's like he's already on the stronger side of champions right now. Literally, I can tell you this. And so I think it's just very unlikely we buff Asol anytime soon. It is possible we just like ruin him with some systemic change, and in that case, sure, we'd be happy to buff him if he's actually quite bad. But the truth here is that if you play Asol, you're winning a lot of your games. Like I'll just tell you straight up, you're gonna win a lot of games playing Asol. So. Hey Nick, forgot to add in the QA post, but I want to drop Q if you got time. I've been answering a few questions from chat between questions, so if you have something and it's something I can answer reasonably quickly, just hit me up. If it's something that's going to be really long, then maybe you'll have to wait until after I get through these questions, because I've been trying to hold on to the longer questions till after I get through these. You can see I'm like not even done with the first tab, although I think this is the tab with the most questions on it at least. Um, uh, let's see.